Hello and welcome to this third movie in the Renderosity tutorial series on POSER Pro 2014 and POSER Pro 10. I'll be guiding you through this one, and this lesson, this movie, will be covering lighting. Now we're going to talk about how you start working with the controls, but more importantly why you would start working with the controls and create an environment that you can go ahead and use some of this knowledge to more successfully set up items in your scene. Before I get started though, I wanted to say that our last movie I knew was going to generate a bunch of email traffic and comment traffic, and it's because the subject of runtimes is kind of like discussing politics or religion at a party. You don't really do it because there's so many different ways to approach it and nobody ever agrees that any one way is the best. So I got some feedback on that saying, why can't you do this and this? All perfectly valid. Thanks for connecting with me and just pointing out some options. I did have one little item come up. I got schooled by a friend of mine that said, you had this problem getting rid of runtimes in your library. It works, but it works kind of wonky. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, let me show you. I had mentioned that when you select a folder, in previous examples of POSER I had worked with, you would get an automatic folder that popped up that allowed me to subtract that folder right here. If I right-click on this folder, I happen to get the settings for Adobe Flash, which is kind of built in, or the functionality is built into POSER. And there was no way to do it, so I was going around and deleting or changing the name of the folder to make it disappear out of the queue. And he said, well, here's how you do it. You can't do it when you're showing all the runtimes. You can't highlight it and delete it. What you have to do is come to Show Library, come down to Master, and then you get this folder that shows up that allows you to subtract it from the library. Now, this doesn't destroy the content that's in it. It simply makes it go away from the library. So I'm back down to my two here. I learned something. I guess that's what happens when I try to keep up with a bunch of different 3D programs for my job. That said, let's hop into the scene. I have put Rex in our scene and made him look like the wayward, angsty, depressed teen of the day. And what we're going to do is light this to convey mood. One of the most important parts about lighting is obviously to show object in your scene, but more importantly, to reveal a mood and tell a story. It's one thing to evenly light objects. It's another to go ahead and help people feel what's going on with the imagery. That's where imagery wins over writing. It helps people see immediately what's going on. So what we're going to do is put our wayward Rex into a scene where he could be leaning up against a brick wall at night. We're going to give a street light. We're going to have car headlight shining on him, and look at how we work with the controls while we do that. So let's come over here and check the default lights that come into any POSER scene when you build it. Right now, this scene looks like it has 3, but I believe there's a 4th one hiding over here. There always seems to be. I'm going to click on this top light, and believe it or not, it does highlight, but it's just this little black circle that's really kind of hard to make out. Over here we have the intensity controls. This little yellow dot allows you to slide it. Now there's something to be aware that it looks like it's maxed out. And what this little intensity scale means is that when you slide the yellow dot all the way to the end, the light is showing at 100%. You may want it brighter, and in fact we will in a little bit, and I'll show you how to change that. We've got colors here. We get a little eyedropper. This is the fastest way to change colors for lights. A little shortcut to the Properties tab. If you click this, all it does is bring this Properties tab forward for the light that you have selected. Then we've got a trash can to delete lights. Even though there may be lights in your scene you don't want, you don't necessarily have to delete them. You can in fact turn them off, and we'll see how to do that. And finally, a little button over here to add lights to your scene. Let's turn this top light into a street light that will be over our character's head, kind of illuminating him with a cold blue type of mercury vapor street light. I think most of those have been replaced with those kind of pink sodium lights now, but hey, we're going to make this look cold and forlorn to echo his apparent state of mind. So with that done, I'm going to click up here and drag around this little orb here, and I get a dynamic presentation of what's going on with the light. Move it over to the side a little bit. And let's see what kind of light this is. The way we do that is coming over here to Properties. By clicking on this, I can check which one of 4 lights this is. It's an infinite light, which is very, very much like the sunshine. The light's a long ways away. It lights everything up evenly within a scene, and that's great. But I don't want everything evenly lit. I want a spotlight, something shining down very, very narrowly onto our subject matter right here. Now let's look at some of these other options over here, all pretty self-explanatory. You've got a checkbox for visible, and that is different than the checkbox for on. If you have a scene that, say, you've got several primary lights, but you've got a bunch of candle lights or ceiling lights, you can make those lights invisible in the scene so you don't see them, but they still render and function as if on. That just cleans up your scene, so it's more of a scene management type of thing. However, if I click the on button, by deselecting and turn it off, we see our scene update right away with that change. Also, there's shadows. Now you may be wondering, why would you ever turn shadows off? Wouldn't that make things look funny? Yes and no. It depends on the need. We do have the ability to create very, very realistic renderings with something called image-based lighting, that IBL, diffuse IBL we have over here, but it takes longer to render. Sometimes it's faster to create light rigs, multiple lights that imitate bouncing light, because it just renders so much faster, and especially in animations, that can be the difference between 15 minutes of rendering and 15 hours of rendering. Now there are two kinds of shadows, ray trace shadows and depth map shadows. By default, depth map shadows are typically what the lights come in with. The reason for that is that it creates a fuzzy little shadow down here which looks more realistic. It's also a fairly quick calculation as far as the program goes, because it says, oh, we've got a little bit of light over here, it'll have a little bit of shadow over here, we'll throw it over there and make it fuzzy, and it calculates very quickly. Ray trace shadows go ahead and give a very hard edge, like you're shining a flashlight at your hand on the ceiling at night, like you did when you were a kid. Those sharp lines are the benefit, or the, I should say, just the quality of ray trace shadows as they get engaged. The depth map shadows, fast calculating, and you can in fact make them softer and softer with these controls. Another option down here that adds to the render time is something called ambient occlusion. If you look at the objects sitting on the table or desk around you, you'll notice that as you get closer to an object, the table underneath it looks like it gets slightly darker. And that's because the object is blocking the light that bounces from other parts in the room. That blocking is called occlusion or occluding. So what we have is that ambient light, that area light, gets blocked by the object. There you go, ambient occlusion. But it has to figure that stuff out. However, it creates a very, very nice look that looks far more realistic if that is your goal in the scene. So with that said, let's go ahead and change the color of our street light. I'll come over here to the color palette right here, and we get a modal box that shows up, and we'll give it this kind of cool alleyway type of light, and leave it like that. I'll move over to my next light right here and click on it. We can see right here that, I forgot to mention, see the properties? What I'm going to want to do is turn this new light into the headlights for like a car. So let me type that in and change the name to make it easy for myself to spot. The blue one visually is obviously the street light, but I'm going to rename this one as well. We'll come back to headlight, and now I'll move this one around too so we can see exactly what's going on. I'll bring it to the front of the orb a little bit, and we'll give it more of a side cast right here and let it go. Now most headlights we're going to, I guess I should say, kind of exaggerate for the sake of clarity. I'm going to change the color of this to something more like a yellow. Two reasons for this. In building a scene, you usually have three primary lights. You may have a bunch of little ones around the scene, you may even have something outdoors, but you have a primary light which does the primary lighting on an object. That is our street light. We have our, or I should say it's sometimes called a fill light. Then we have a key light, which is our headlight, which lights up key elements of the character. I want us to be able to see his face very clearly, and I want to get the idea that we can see one edge of the body, it's light on one side, dark on the other. And then sometimes you can do something called a skim light. Not always required. This whole system is usually referred to as three-point lighting. The skim light is in the back and can illuminate shoulders and separate them from, say, the background right here. Obviously, if we wanted this to look dark and foreboding and we had a wall, you might not want that, but you might. Take a look at television tonight and you'll see them doing that all the time. With that done, let's see how our scene is looking. Well, actually, let me come down here a little bit further. We've got our headlight over here. What's this one? I'll click on that and we see light 1 in our properties tab over here. I see that it is a diffuse image-based light. What does this mean and why should I care about something like this? Let's come back over here to materials, and we'll see that the materials that make up this light, the color, our other lights, if we went into the materials room, we would see a simple color over here highlighting it for that. But the image-based lighting, well, it uses images. And these are special images that are on a spherical map, or what is sometimes referred to as a probe. It is an actual photo that has been wrapped or unwrapped from a spherical shot that can give you very, very realistic lighting in your scene. And there's something else called HDR lighting, high dynamic range imagery, that creates super realistic reflections in objects. And the only way to really achieve that is with image-based lighting. It takes longer to render, and it's not as precise as the other lighting we're working with. So I'm bringing this up just to show you that it's there, worth playing with, and we'll play with it in some additional scenes or movies that come along a little bit later. But what I want to do right now is not include that. So I'm going to turn it off in the Properties palette. I don't want to get rid of the light. I may want it later. But here we go. So we've got our basic scene right here. And if I move my camera around the scene just a little bit, or if I like this particular position and want to lower it for a little more drama so that it doesn't look like I'm standing there with my cam phone taking a picture of this guy, I can go ahead and switch my camera. I'm going to right click on it, come down to camera view, go to posing camera. You can do the same thing, by the way, coming up to display camera view and choosing it from the list up here as well. But let me rotate this around the scene. And as I do that, one of the reasons I would even want to do this is that I get a different presentation of the lighting controls right here. There's a light back behind here that I'm going to want to actually raise up a little bit so I can see it. Maybe move it over just a little bit more. Let me switch back to my main camera. This would be the one I would want to render from. And this is where I can turn this into one of those little skim lights. Let me click on it, see how bright it is. I'll leave it right there for now. Let's see what this is looking like from a render standpoint. Simply come up to the camera, click render, and we haven't discussed the render settings. That's its own subject matter that will be coming up. But just know there's ways to do fast renders and slow renders. Right now it's calculating how light gets absorbed by certain objects. That's the subsurface scattering. We've got a nice quality to this. Obviously if the background was black, it would look even more like nighttime, but headlights are pretty bright. So let's take a look at the headlights. We'll come over here and click on that. We'll come over to our parameter dials, and we can see that when we come down to intensity, it's at 100%, the maximum on the intensity slider. But headlights being much brighter than that, I'm simply going to click in here and enter a value of something like 300. It looks very bright right now. If we go ahead and click and render our scene, we'll see that we get a completely different type of look going on right here. It does the subsurface calculation. This would be how light comes through fingers, thin body objects, those types of things as it gets illuminated. And this is looking a little bit more interesting. I would suggest that a headlight could be even brighter. Right now it looks like the guy's sitting outside of a honky-tonk and he's being illuminated by the light from the inside. Kind of a nice look, but for headlights, more power. Let's go ahead and crank this up to 500. And let's take a look at our render settings real quick. This gives us a modal dialog box that has two options, manual settings and auto settings. The manual settings you can play with. It's generally faster, especially if you're new to POSER, to come over here to auto and simply use this slider. As you get further and further right, you get a better and better render, but you also happen to have the program take longer and longer to render. So we saw how it looked right there. If I click this up by one notch right here, we're engaging ray tracing, we're engaging the cast shadows that was always on. It's increasing the number of pixel samples that's being used. It's doing some irradiance caching for realistic types of rendering, and some other options over here that we'll deal with in an upcoming movie. With that done, I'll come down to render now. We've got our low camera angle. It recalculates the subsurface scattering right here, but now we can see we're getting a totally different quality of light going on. I put him so his backside was through the floor, since we can't really do the squishing of normal flesh. And we can see that getting brighter. We could continue to play with it. We may want to increase the brightness of the street light, but that's how you start thinking about working with lighting. How do I help people see the story? How do I let people imagine part of the story? And here's how you use lights for that. To recap, you can select individual lights, use shortcut controls over here for intensity and color. You can go ahead and specifically change all these things like all objects in POSER with the parameters dial. You can come to properties, change the names of the lights to something more meaningful so that you can find them, identify them faster in your scene. And then you can go ahead and continue to adjust your scene and camera angles so that you don't have the same view all the time. Lighting is incredibly important to creating enjoyable scenes to look at, and it's much more than simply showing things in your scene. It's helping your viewers see a story.